It's perspective. More specifically, the intuition to be able to draw and orient objects and light sources inside of a space relative to the position of an imaginary camera. Why perspective? Well, reflective surfaces simply reflect the objects in the space around them. The look of the reflection is defined by the position of those objects and the direction of the light, distorted by the form of the surface and then reflected back to the position of our camera. All of this happening within a space. What about perspective do we need to know for metals? Well, number one, how to imagine, or in this case draw out, the surrounding environment in linear perspective. And number two, how to distort that image to appear the way that the surface of the metal would actually reflect it. So this is our knight. To make their armor look nice and reflective, we need to understand the environment around them. Reflective surfaces are like pictures inside of a picture. The image inside is distorted by the curves of the object. We're looking at our knight mostly dead on, but with a slight downward angle. We should keep this in mind for when we draw out the environment, since reflections will change based on the position of the camera relative to the reflective object. It's important to remember that light bounces off of reflective objects at equal and opposite angles. This changes the look of the reflection for surfaces that stay flat or surfaces that curve away and around. Flat surfaces angled away from the camera will reflect details that are an opposite angle away, but round surfaces tend to have at least some part of it facing the camera at all times. The center of the reflection inside of a round object shows an image angled back at us. If we look down on a reflective sphere, it will reflect a curved image angled up at us. If we look up at one, the reflection would depict one angled down. I've also linked this nice model viewer of an environment sphere down in the description that might help visualize the concept a bit more or be used as a kind of reference. Okay, so before we get into drawing our linear environment, I'm just going to quickly cover some rough perspective guidelines that I try to keep in mind whenever I draw. In linear perspective, any object represented by a box can have up to 3 main vanishing points at any time based on how it turns in space. 1-point, 2-point, or 3-point perspective doesn't really refer to or limit the number of vanishing points in a single scene. I like to try to think about it as the number of main vanishing points any single object has. Unless a single pair of parallel lines is facing the camera dead on, any amount of tilting will cause them to start to slightly converge into a vanishing point. Also, any number of lines parallel with each other in space will converge to the same vanishing point. And finally, the closer an object is to the camera, the harsher this converging effect appears, making for more aggressively distorted objects in boxes. Now, I don't really draw that many environment shots, so I haven't really played around with using perspective grids yet, even though I really should get down to practicing that. But I'm using mostly my intuition of the space around to draw, only keeping in mind my perspective guidelines when I feel like something could maybe be placed better. Personally, I think improving your feel for form and perspective is useful because it applies to everything. It helps with placing lines, it helps with drawing figures, and it helps with lighting anything. I'm imagining the elements to the sides too because the reflections in the curved armor will catch a lot of things to the sides of it, not just the front. Now that we have the image of our reflection done, let's try to translate that into curvilinear perspective. But before we try the armor, let's practice on something round. Don't forget to flip your image since we're drawing a reflection. Note that this type of curvilinear distortion only applies to rounded objects. Flat plates will reflect things in a linear way, while cylinders would stretch the image out along itself. Don't hesitate to pull up references if something doesn't feel right. So this is the part of the video where I have to apologize because I spent an entire afternoon racking my brain on how to draw this reflection and then realized that I wasn't recording the time lapse. I can't record audio where I draw because it's too noisy, so I'll just have to go through my process while future me demonstrates on screen. I am going to go over how I went from this colored line art with flat colors to this rendered metal layer by layer. Okay, the first layer, this metal reflection layer, is the most important layer. It's mostly painted using solid brush and some lasso tool and the fill tool. This is basically the main layer where I worked and tried to figure out the reflections of the environment sort of projected onto this armor. I basically referenced my own egg and the environment drawing as a guide. Now, remember how the angle of the object and how the surface turns relative to the camera matters? To understand which details of the environment are projected on which part of the armor, you have to imagine how the object's 3D surface turns and faces the different things around it. Basically, if a certain part is facing the floor, I make it look like the floor. If a surface turns toward the sky, I make it look like the sky. If something turns towards these boxes to the side or this wall, I paint it the same color as that. Now don't forget the objects around or attached to the character, like the arms and legs or the plates sort of overlapping the reflective parts of the armor, because those things will reflect on the armor, but sort of in a darker way because it's sort of casting a shadow as well. Cylindrical objects, like the armor around the arms and the legs, tend to stretch out the reflected image, so I like to imagine what it's facing and just roughly stretch it out along the length of the tube. For the concave areas, like this neck piece, I imagine would invert the image. Basically, I looked up a lot of reflective knight armor references, and that seems to be what happens with that kind of bever neck protector bit. So I just kind of copied it and imagined the image upside down, basically. Now this color dodge layer, or glow dodge layer if you're using Clip Studio Paint like I am, is for the highlights. Really, it could be set to normal, but I like how the edges of the white work on glow dodge or color dodge. This is pretty much the most important layer for making it feel more shiny and metallic. Little tip for highlights on reflective things: the highlights tend to follow the position of the sun or the light source in the image, and I think more light sources in your surrounding image, in your surrounding space, would make for more highlights. Now, sometimes for the position of the highlights on more tricky parts like the legs and the arms where it stretches out, I kind of just guess sometimes, so just use your intuition. We have these two overlay layers, which basically I just used to color correct a little bit. The white one, I just felt like the sky needed some extra brightness, and the orange one is to help the color of the lights match the sun a bit more in the reference. We have this extra multiply shadow sort of layer, which I used to darken the ground a little bit in the reflection. Also, I wanted to add some ambient shadows to the armor for where it turns to just sell the roundness a little bit. Finally, we have this Perlin noise layer for extra texture. I don't think you really need this, but I thought it looked nice. Basically, to do this, you just have to go over here to filter, render, and then Perlin noise. I like to set it to 2, but really could just be any low number. And you can either set it to overlay or soft light. I think I used soft light here, and I pushed the opacity a little bit down until where I like it. Every layer that I used is masked and clipped to the main armor for good measure. And this is what we have. I mean, you could render the internal image a little bit more to make it nice and detailed, or, I mean, I tried blurring it, but blurring inside of reflective surfaces sort of happens by distance, so you have to think about that as well, and it's not just Gaussian blur with the mask and it works, so just try different things, see if it works. Well, that's it. Hopefully this tutorial, if you can call it that, wasn't too confusing or bad. If it was, I'll probably try to cover this topic again with a better video in the future. I mean, that's all we want to do anyway, we just want to get better, bit by bit. Well, that's the end of the video. Thanks for watching.